I'd like to introduce the members of our next panel for a discussion on Middle East instability, telling the difference between friends and enemies. Abbas Kadhim is an academic and author focused on Iraq, Iran, the Persian Gulf, and Islam. He is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute, Johns Hopkins University, SAIS, and the president of the Institute of Shia Studies in Washington, D.C. Joshua Landis is professor and director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He is a frequent commentator on Middle East affairs and also publishes Syria Comment, a daily newsletter on Syrian politics. Daniel Larison is a senior editor at the American Conservative, where he keeps a popular foreign policy blog. He has been published in the New York Times, Dallas Morning News, Orthodox Life, and the Front Porch Republic. Trita Parsi is the founder of the National Iranian-American Council and regular commentator on U.S.-Iranian relations and Middle East geopolitics. He is the author of 3 books, including Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. Paul Pilar is a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies. He served 28 years in the U.S. intelligence community, including National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. His latest book is Why America Misunderstands the World, National Experience and the Roots of Misperception. And our moderator is Kelley Beaucar Vlahos, executive editor of the American Conservative. She is formerly a political editor at foxnews.com and has been writing and reporting for TAC since 2007, focusing on national security, foreign policy, and civil liberty issues. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panel.
Thank you, Johnny. Shortly after Barack Obama was inaugurated in 2009, he traveled to Cairo in June to give a speech many across the globe had hoped would be a new beginning for U.S. relations with the Arab and Muslim world. Heralded as an impressive piece of oratory, it emphasized Israel-Palestinian peace, confronting violent extremism, human rights, and better understanding with Arab communities across the globe. Soon, it was like the speech, as Brookings scholar Shadi Hamid pointed out, never really happened. The Arab Spring found Washington reacting awkwardly, if not passively, to the wave of protests in Egypt, Bahrain, and elsewhere. It stuck to its dictator partners and gave tepid rebuke over crackdowns on protesters. Criticism of the Israeli settlements and the peace process stalemate were ineffective. The U.S. military, CIA drone wars were escalated, targeting Muslims in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and Afghanistan. President Obama officially ended the war in Iraq, but ISIS was slowly taking over the country, and our military would remain there until only recently, but not before the Iraqi military we had helped build was destroyed in the fight against the Islamic State, which did not exist before we invaded in 2003. Libya was invaded ostensibly to free the country from the Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, but since then there was no after-action plan. And 7 years later, it is still a failed state. Aside from the landmark Iranian nuke deal, Obama brought nothing but the status quo to his 8-year tenure. Fast forward. President Trump's Cairo moment came when he clutched a glowing orb with the authoritarian leaders of Egypt and Saudi Arabia and a clear signal to the rest of the world. He was casting his lot with the regional Arab powers against Iran and Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He then sent his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, shuttling back and forth and solidifying alliances with the Saudi kingdom and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, some say at the detriment of its alliance with Qatar, the peace process in the Middle East, leverage in Syria, and of course the Iran nuclear deal, which Trump terminated in May of this year, at least on our end. Washington's involvement in Syria has largely been opaque, with anti-ISIS mission turning into a mission to thwart Iran and Russia, our support for the Kurdish factions there, heightening tension with Turkey, and ISIS continuing to regroup among the opposition fighters on our side of the fight. Today, millions are starving in Yemen as the U.S. supports Saudi Arabia and the UAE in their regional proxy war against Iran. And the peace process is in shambles with Israel and Palestinians fighting each other as recently as a few days ago. Now, the U.S. has imposed new crippling sanctions on Iran. In this 2-year mark, we need to ask, is it time for Trump to discern who our real enemies and our frenemies are? Does he even want to? Has his foreign policy in the last year been indicative of his America First campaign promises, most specifically getting out of costly wars and entanglements? Overall, has the geopolitical landscape become more complicated and uncertain? And if so, can he recalibrate before it's too late? Here to discuss all of these issues, which there are so many to unpack, is a very impressive panel of Middle East experts and scholars, each of whom bring a particular focus to the table. And thank you for joining us. I want to start with Daniel. What most recent headline has been the sanctions that have been imposed by the Trump administration on Iran. What does the Trump administration expect to even get out of this? And what has been the reaction from Europe and the rest of the world, which has been trading with Iran? And what does it mean for those relationships?
Thanks, Kelley. One of the things to think about when looking at the administration's Iran policy is first looking at what they say that they're hoping to do and then looking at what they actually do. So, for instance, they're imposing the sanctions because they say they want Iran to be a normal country, by which they mean they want Iran to do whatever we want, to curtail all of its foreign policy activities that we disagree with, to shut down their nuclear program, and to get rid of all of their ballistic missiles, essentially to let us dictate their foreign policy and a significant part of their domestic policy. That would already be a fairly extreme policy in itself. But then you look at what they're actually doing, which is to impose such crippling sanctions, or attempting to impose such crippling sanctions, that it creates severe economic problems inside the country, and their hope is to create such bad conditions that eventually the population will get rid of the government for them. And so it's a regime change in all but name policy. Looking at the reaction from the rest of the world, it's important to remember that these sanctions are being reimposed illegitimately because of the decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. None of the rest of the parties to the agreement agrees with this decision, and so they're not cooperating with it, and they're trying to find workarounds to avoid secondary sanctions from the U.S. And so you've seen the Europeans try to create what they call a special purpose vehicle to allow for transactions to circumvent the institutions that would normally be under the effects of U.S. sanctions. Of course, that vehicle is still very much in its planning stages, and so it hasn't really gotten up and running yet. But the political will to resist this pressure campaign is clearly there, and you're seeing the same thing from Russia and China as well.
Just to follow up on that, in terms of our European partners, can they find a workaround? Will they? And we often hear that we're so powerful that these companies and countries will have to bend to our will in the end. Do you get any sense of how successful they will be in getting a workaround and leaving us isolated in this policy?
Yeah, I think they'll be partly successful because for them it's not simply a matter of the nuclear deal or their trade relations with Iran, but they see it very much as a matter of their own ability to conduct foreign policy on their own. And so I think they're really quite determined to do it, and they're going to find mechanisms to do it, and that's going to have long-term effects on the U.S. ability to sanction other states and entities in the future.
I want to turn to you for a second. Can you give us, I have a two-pronged question. Can you give us a sense of how this is playing out in Iran? Is this benefiting the hardliners' position? And after that, can you talk a little bit about how Saudi Arabia has sort of manipulated this situation? What is I know that they had opposed the nuclear agreement from the beginning, and they had lobbyists here in Washington fighting against it. But I think in the end that they sort of stood down. But how much have they been involved in sort of seeing Trump get out of the deal and imposing these sanctions afterward?
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here, and thank you for the American Conservative for putting together this excellent conference. On the issue of the reaction inside of Iran to what Trump has done to the JCPOA, you're quite right. This has definitely benefited the hardliners. We can see that clearly in the internal debate in Iran. But he has done something that is even worse than that. It has turned a very large part of the population away from the idea that engagement with the West actually can benefit the country. For quite some time, hardliners were of the opinion that Iran could only resist the United States, that the United States would never accept Iran, and as a result, there was no other option but to have some form of animosity towards the United States. The population, by and large, consistently viewed that engagement would be much preferable, blamed the Iranian hardliners for a big part of the tensions between the United States and Iran. And they could point to the fact that there had never really been a very strong, consistent, and sustainable effort for engagement from either the US or from Iran. Now with the JCPOA, we not only had that engagement, it was successful, and the hardliner argument prior to the deal was, well, go ahead, strike that deal, but we promise you the United States will betray that agreement and you will get stabbed in the back. 3 years into it, that narrative sounds has the appearance of having been vindicated in the eyes of a lot of people in Iran. And that's a major problem because, as Senator Rand Paul pointed out earlier this morning, the Iranian population, by and large, has a very positive predisposition towards the United States. It is one of the most modern countries in the region. It is a country in which the population is way ahead when it comes to the values, etc., compared to the government itself. If you were to take out a lot of the governments in the Middle East right now, their societies would likely produce a more radical government. In Iran, it would clearly be the opposite because of the values of that population. And to see them now turning away from the idea that engagement with the United States actually can be to their benefit, I think is highly problematic because ultimately, a country of that size, 80 million people, is going to be very, very important for the United States. And we should be able to look beyond regimes and look at societies and populations when we make these decisions. Secondly, on the issue of the Saudi angle in all of this, I thought it was interesting that when this thing with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was unraveling, that the president essentially came out and said, well, we need Saudi Arabia for our strategy against Iran. And I thought it was a remarkable capitulation of American leverage, because the bottom line is this: the United States doesn't need to have this confrontation with Iran. The United States had a functioning nuclear deal. You can have whatever criticisms you want with it, but it was working until this day, despite the fact that the US has pulled out. The Iranians are still abiding by that agreement. That was once again confirmed by the IAEA just this week. So we have other options. We can pursue the diplomacy that had been established. We could use that diplomacy to be able to address the remaining issues of conflict between the United States and Iran, and there are plenty of them. But we had proven now that through diplomacy, even the most difficult issues between the US and Iran could be resolved. So we had a path to be able to address these other issues. So the United States did not need this confrontation. The Saudis, however, felt that they needed the confrontation because of their own internal rivalry with Iran in the region. So it's the Saudis that need the United States for this policy of confrontation, not the United States that needs Saudi Arabia for this policy of confrontation, because the United States doesn't need the confrontation to begin with. It has diplomatic options. Unfortunately, those have been closed down, but they can be resurrected.
me slide that one over. Okay. Can you give me a sense of when you think that it was decided? Was it decided that Trump would get out of this deal while he was on the campaign trail, or was it? Do you think it was when John Bolton came in and he had advisors around him that finally convinced him? Was there a tug and pull at any point where maybe we would have stayed in that deal, or was a promise made ahead of time with the Saudis, and that's maybe why they stood down early on when the agreement was made? Anybody want to answer that in terms of the politics here?
I'll take a crack at it. In terms of Trump's thinking on this, I think it's one of the places where he's been actually most consistent in his foreign policy positioning. He ran very much as an Iran hawk during the campaign. He appeared at a rally specifically denouncing the nuclear deal, and it's been one of the things that he's stuck to throughout, regardless of any other changes or modifications that he's made. And so I think that has then been, that impulse to get rid of the deal was strengthened by the people that were around him, but it was always there.
Okay. Let's shift over to Syria. Joshua, I know this is something that you've been writing about, thinking about quite a bit. And this is going to be, this will sound like a kind of a facetious question, but what is our policy in Syria right now? Are we there really just to thwart Iran at this point? Is it to put pressure on Assad, which it seems to be the official reasoning, to give a buffer to the Kurds? And if so, are we even succeeding in that? Can you sort of like put things in perspective for our audience about why we are there right now, and are we succeeding at that goal?
Well, I would describe the U.S. policy in Syria as a dog in the manger policy right now. It is to deny Syria to America's enemies, Iran and Russia. Largely, Syria has been lost. Assad has won the war on the ground. He is reestablishing himself at least in 60% of Syria. And the United States owns 30%, the northern part of Syria and a big hunk around the Iraq border, Tanf, where it has a bunch of troops that are blocking the main highway from Baghdad to Damascus. And Jeffries, the special representative for Syrian engagement, Jim Jeffries, Jim Jeffrey, he has described this as we're going to stay there for the long haul, and we're going to use our economic tools to force Assad to accept elections through the UN that he will lose. So it's a form of regime change, but without American troops on the ground. And the way he hopes to carry that out is to deny Syria the 30% of its territory in the north, which includes 60% of its oil and gas, includes most of its good water because America controls the dam over the Euphrates, and much of its best agriculture in the north there. So this will keep Assad poor. America will also stop the main highway between Iraq and Baghdad. And it is putting intense pressure on European countries and other international organizations like the UN, World Bank, and so forth, not to fund Syrian reconstruction. The new budget for Syria was just announced by the Assad government a few weeks ago, which was $8.9 billion. This is for all of Syria, and there's about $1 billion point something for reconstruction, in an estimated $1 trillion worth of need for reconstruction. So what America is trying to do is make Assad government so poor that it will not be able to be stabilized. Iran and Russia will have to sink money in if it wants to stabilize it, and this will beggar the Assad government and Iran. So it is an adjunct to the Iran policy, which is to make them as poor as possible so that they will ultimately, the regimes will collapse. And this, in a sense, is part of that failed state policy, is to beggar your enemies to the point where they collapse. And we've seen a lot of that in the Middle East. We now have failed states, sprinkled right throughout the Middle East. And if this policy were actually to work, it would be a disaster. Not only for spreading instability in the region, but I think it'd be very un-American. In a sense, it's an abandonment of the most basic American principles, which are that if we stand as an example of successful capitalism, successful growth of a middle class, that ultimately people will buy into the values of the US, not to make them poorer. If you make them poorer, they're going to be more dictatorial, more authoritarian. It is going to reverse the trends, and it's going to increase terrorism over the long run. Now, let's look at this American foreign policy. How sustainable is it in Syria? We have set up shop in the north of Syria, which is the Kurdish-dominated part of Syria. There are 10% of Syrian population of about 22 million is Kurdish. That means there are about 2 million Kurds. And we are trying to promote Kurdish nationalism in the north and develop a government that will be anti-Assad, which we can do. And the Kurds are quite the Kurds want a large measure of autonomy in the north. The trouble is, that's the most underdeveloped part of the country. Much of the population in the north, where America is occupying, is Arab. And this means that there are terrible tensions between the Arab population and the Kurdish population. It is an extremely weak reed on which to build a regional Middle East policy. Not only that, but it alienates the Turks tremendously because they see the rise of Kurdish YPG in their north, which is related to the PKK, as a policy that will end up losing Turkey its entire east, where there's a Kurdish majority. So they are determined to destroy this. Assad is determined to destroy it. Russia is determined to destroy it. And Iran is determined to destroy it. So America is standing there with 2 million Kurds who are very poor. And America refuses to rebuild the north. President Trump just recently said that $200 million, which had been scheduled to use for stabilization, he was not going to pay for. The Saudis had to pay for it. And this means that we're not going to rebuild the north. We're going to sit there to deny it to Assad. And it's going to create more failed states in the region. It's not going to get Assad to leave power. So it condemns the region to poverty. If I can conclude with one last notion. In a larger vision of the Middle East, Iran has become a dominant ally of Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah, and Lebanon. There is such a thing as a Shiite Crescent that King Abdullah of Jordan talked about and feared, and the Saudis fear. And America wants to destroy that. It couldn't do it through war by helping the Syrian rebels. And now it's going to try to do it economically. The problem with this is that in many ways, the only hope for growth in the northern Middle Eastern states is if Iran builds a pipeline through these states, if transportation is allowed to go through, if roads can be built. There is a Shiite majority in the northern Middle East. If you add up Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, there are more Shiite Arabs in those three countries together than there are Sunni Arabs. It is not unnatural, this power center that Iran is building. Iran has a big middle class, it has resources. If America were to allow it to build a pipeline to the Mediterranean and Europe and feed Europe with oil and gas, it would bring Iran towards Europe and the West. By cutting it off, trying to crush it, America is going to invite China and Russia into Iran. And it is going to exclude itself by building a unipolar pillar on Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, not balancing, not trying to patch up relations with Iran. The United States is isolating itself. It's going to push the Middle East into the hands of its enemies, if you will, and it's going to lose. I think it's building a very bad policy. Now, this may help Saudi Arabia and Israel in the short run, but I do not believe it helps America.
Josh, I have heard administration officials say the reason why we need to stay in Syria right now is to thwart Iran. As long as they're there, we're there. What is the real harm? You mentioned this, the Shia Crescent. You mentioned the influence. What might happen if there was a pipeline? What threat is that to the United States? Can you give me what the administration and the more right, hardcore warmongers in our government think, and what in reality, is there a threat for that Shia Crescent, for that Shia influence to make its way across?
Look, the Saudis are worried about Iranian influence in the Persian Gulf. America is too. America learned one lesson from World War II, which is we beat Hitler because we stopped Hitler from getting gas and oil. The El Alamein and Stalingrad, the hinge of fate, as Churchill called it. And ever since, America's been preparing for World War III and wants to have its hand on the spigot. And today, Saudi Arabia is our hand on the spigot. And the Persian Gulf, domination of the Persian Gulf, the Fifth Fleet, and so forth. We're worried that we're going to lose that. But I think that we are losing it. We will lose it if we don't balance with Iran. And Iran is not a danger to us. Building that pipeline to Europe is a good thing because it will compete with Russia. Today, Trump is terrified that Germany is becoming dependent on Russia. He has gone and insulted the Germans by saying you're just dependent on the Russians. If you want competition for oil and gas to Europe, you need to build that pipeline from Iran directly across the desert of Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean and to Europe. It's the cheapest, it's the easiest, it gets all of that Gulf, and it would compete with Russia, in a sense. Instead of forcing Russia and Iran together by denying that ability and forcing Iran to sell its oil up through Russia, you're pushing them together. So America should be building both sides of the street, both Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Okay. Abbas, you are one of the few Iraqi-American scholars left in this town because nobody seems to care about what's happening in Iraq these days. But in a way, the 2003 invasion sort of precipitated all of this unrest and turmoil in the Middle East. But we can't forget, that there was still unrest and turmoil in Iraq right now. Can you tell me a little bit about, what the diplomatic relationship is with the U.S. and Iraq since ISIS was destroyed there? And can maybe talk a little bit about the Iranian influence there today and how that might play into all of this regionally?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation and for putting this conference together. I appreciate it. I don't know about me being the last one standing. I kind of like it. The diplomatic relation, I once wrote a book chapter on the U.S. policy towards Iraq. And the only title I came up with after I wrote the paper was opting for the lesser evil. And it seems to be that U.S. foreign policy or U.S. policy towards Iraq always had been since, the span I looked was 1958 to 2008. So, and it's still the same. Always our policy is who is the lesser evil in Iraq, and then we would go by them. We never really had a stable, well-crafted policy that would be on a strategic level. It's always tactics. Now, it has to do with the nature of the turmoil and upheavals in the Iraqi politics since U.S. started to take interest. That's in the post-British domination era, 1950s, with the Republic establishment until now. Iraq and the U.S. had been going through turmoil in their relations. But still, that does not negate the fact that we do not have at our policy making any strategy that would look at Iraq in for the long term. It still is the same, even though after 2003, we owned the change and we were, the U.S. was the midwife, if you will, that toppled Saddam Hussein and brought the form of democratization that is going on in Iraq. The word ally, I think it's loaded and it's unsuitable to describe any one of the Middle Eastern countries that are close to the United States. The only ally that we have that we can call an ally is Turkey. But all of the others, ally is a euphemism or a code word for an agent, a follower, a conduit. You can name it anything. Somebody, we tell them what to do on a certain day, they will do it, and then we turn our back and leave. This alliance between Iraq and the United States, which I advocated for a long time, I'm a very strong advocate of having a real alliance between the United States and Iraq, where Iraq would look at the U.S. as the main ally in the world. This so-called alliance was tested when ISIS took Mosul on June 10, 2014. The U.S. was no show. In fact, the stated policy that was told to Iraq that if Maliki made reforms, political reforms, we will consider coming and helping out. Political reforms that would have needed years, while ISIS was going towards Baghdad at 50 miles an hour. In 3 days, they cut the distance by 3/4. That is not much of an alliance. Who became or jumped in to show themselves as the ally? The Iranians. The Iranians sent weapons on the next day, then they sent advisors, and then when Grand Ayatollah Sistani gave this fatwa that asked Iraqis to go and join the military, and they turned out to enlist by the tens of thousands. I was actually in Iraq when all of this was happening on a visit. The government didn't know what to do with these people, and the Iranians kind of gave the orders to some structural fighting groups, militias, that used to be in Iraq before 2011, and they dropped their weapons. And they just came back to existence, and then they took people to fight. What do? We started complaining that there are Iran-backed militias that are there. Iraq had no choice but to take anybody who was coming to help. That was the test of the alliance, and the alliance failed that test big time. And then it continued. We always look at these things from Washington, from an American-centric, and that's okay. But also we have to be brave and look at it from the Iraqi side. Just sit across the table and see how the Iraqis look at it. When all of the agreements that we had with the Iraqis were set aside, and the only agreement that we followed up on was the security agreement. There is what was called the strategic framework agreement that involved everything: culture, technology, education, you name it, economics. None of that really was done or followed up on in any way. We don't know what to do it, and the Iraqis are not asking, and we are not offering, and everything is done. Now, you take to the other side of the question is what kind of diplomatic relations we have. The White House doesn't have an Iraq expert. None that I can call an expert. The State Department at the upper level doesn't too. There are some good people at State Department who are at the working sort of staff level who are good. I don't know how much influence they have. I meet them all the time and they are okay. But there's more than that. It seems that Iraqi policy right now is an auxiliary to the Iran policy. During the tenure of former Secretary of State Larison, we combined the Iraq desk with the Iran desk. We used to have Iraq desk and an Iran desk. Now, both of them, and also, moreover, and I don't want it to be understood that I have, all of the people at the state are good friends, and I am in talking relations with, and I meet them, give them advice, they listen. I don't know what they do with it though. But in general, we had a great DAS who dealt with Iraq, Deputy Assistant Secretary Joe Pennington. He's no longer there. I think the replacement of Joe came at the worst time, and it didn't help. That's the other side. Our foreign policy towards Iraq now, it's outsourced to the embassy, not at the State Department, and also to, it's kind of a creature with two heads. with the envoy, special envoy for ISIS, Brett McGurk. McGurk did very well on ISIS. He did terribly on everything else that he handled. He shouldn't have been handling them. On the formation of government, he's been there, and his footprint was so heavy that was resented by the Iraqis. There were so many things, and I think that is wrong. We need to take that and involve normal policy making here in Washington rather than outsource everything from them. The Iraqis know that also. They don't have to bother to come to the U.S. State Department at all. If they need anything, they go to the embassy. And that is unhealthy. So that is pretty much where we are. I think we do not have policy towards Iraq. I think if we have anything that we can call policy, it is part of our grand scheme, and I don't use scheme here in the negative word, in the grand framework of the Iran policy. And that's about it. There is no Iraq policy for the sake of an Iraq policy, unfortunately. If you have any follow-up on that, I will talk about it later.
Well, just a quick follow-up for you. I mean, what do the Iraqi people think about America right now? I mean, do they see us as liberators? Do they see us as a pain in their side? Did they see us as, basically not fulfilling promises made? I mean, or do they think anything of it at all?
I think the Iraqis right now, at least every time I go there, and I go very often and talk to them, the United States is not on the radar of the Iraqis. The Iraqis are more interested into their hard life, the lack of services, the corruption that is going on in the country. The United States is far away for the Iraqis. It's not an occupier. It's not present even to notice. Now, that's not to negate that the fact we have been instrumental in the defeat of ISIS. I think Iraqis wouldn't have been able to do it without our Air Force help and all of the other alliance we gave. It's just it's not coming through to the Iraqis. That's the average Iraqi. The government itself we cannot call them a U.S. allies. Most of the government are people who are either close to the Iranian government or close to the British. We have more, I once joked saying that I'm a historian. I have not heard about or read about any time in Iraq since 1920 where we had so many people with with the UK passports running Iraq. In those days in 1920, of course, everybody was a U.S. official running Iraq during the mandate. Now we have pretty much more than 80% of the people who are running the Iraqi state in all kind of positions have UK passports. We talk about the president, until recently we talked about the prime minister, we talk about so many others in the ministers level and in the parliament and elsewhere. 45 agencies in Iraq are run, including the national intelligence, with people who are British citizens. So the British are closer to that. You asked also about Iran, and quickly, one thing I want to say, just to shed, it was very well articulated by Trita and Josh and others. But the Iranians cannot afford to lose Iraq. For them, Iraq is an existential necessity. The U.S. can afford losing Iraq. In fact, it acts as if it doesn't mind losing Iraq. From the days of President Obama until today. Iraq for them is a war they inherited. President Obama called it a war of choice. President Trump is not really much interested in doing anything with it now because he has other fish to fry. But for the Iranians, there is a more than 1,000-kilometer border. For the sanctions that we speak now about, if they are to succeed, Iraq has to seal this border. We cannot impose sanctions without the cooperation of the Iraqi state, and the Iraqis said they do not want to do it. Not only they do not want to do it because they are against the United States or they are pro-Iran, it's because there is $14 billion a year of trade exchange. Every single item of food and other necessity that Iraq gets it from Iran. In order for the Iraqis to replace this supply, they have to take months and months, if not years, to be able to get other suppliers with the inconvenience, with everything else. We gave the Iraqis 45 days to figure out something. I don't know what they will do. Unfortunately, there will not be anything. We have to extend it. But the Iranians definitely look at Iraq as an existential necessity for them, and they have to, and they worked very hard to cultivate all of the relations, not just with the Shia, but Shia, Sunnis. Now there is in Iraq, you hear the term, the Sunnis of Iran, with the Iraq now is aligned into two major groups in government. The Kurds as well are split into two halves, and one half is, the president, who is not an Iranian agent by any stretch of imagination, but it was the Iranians who paved the way for him to be the president and defeat Masoud Barzani's candidate. Same thing with the Speaker of the Parliament, and definitely same thing with the Prime Minister. So Iran is a player because it has so much and so high a stake in Iraq, and they are doing it as a necessity.
Thank you. Paul, I'd like to get your opinion. I want to shift back to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Yemen. There's been a lot of talk at this conference about U.S. assistance to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and what is going on in Yemen. And we hear Trump administration officials say constantly that we are there, we are assisting Saudi Arabia to thwart Iranian influence, not only influence, but Iran is causing the famine there and the epidemic and the violence. And that is their standard response to why we are helping. Can you kind of put a little bit of that in perspective? How much is Iran a threat in Yemen, in this so-called proxy war? Do we really need to be assisting the Saudi alliance there? And what happened with Khashoggi, will that sort of be a game changer in terms of our future relationship with those two?
Yeah, thank you, Kelley. The policy, toward not just Iran, but the Middle East of this administration is going to continue to be symbolized by that laying of hands on the glowing orb that you mentioned in your introduction. Abbas just pointed out how policy toward Iraq has been kind of a byproduct of policy toward Iran, and the policy toward Iran is to confront, bash, punish, isolate, and basically deconstruct Iran to the maximum extent possible. I mean, it's almost that simple. And so how Saudi Arabia plays into this, as it relates to either Khashoggi or the Yemeni war or anything else, is Saudi Arabia is, of course, one of the major regional rivals of Iran, if not the major regional rival. And it's as simple as thinking that the enemy of my enemy is definitely my friend, without actually looking in detail at exactly what the Saudis are doing. Of course, the Yemeni war is a disaster. It's become the Crown Prince's Vietnam. The turning of that war into what has commonly been described as the current worst humanitarian disaster ongoing is overwhelmingly because of the aerial assault on civilian targets led by the Saudis. For the Iranians, quite in contrast to, say, either Iraq or Syria, which are very important relationships for the Iranians, Yemen is more of a sideshow. I mean, the Houthi rebellion had to do with these very local issues of how the tribes in the north of Yemen felt they were not getting proper attention from whoever was in charge in Sana'a, including Salih, who was sort of our guy there for some 25 years. And as long as the Crown Prince and the Saudis have gotten into this Vietnam of theirs, the Iranians are happy to see them bleed. And so we'll continue to see some aid going to the Houthis, relatively minor compared to the enormous military effort by the Saudi-led coalition. And so what the Trump administration will do is its policy is so firmly centered on bashing, isolating, punishing, tearing down Iran that any kind of significant course correction of that is just out of the question. And instead, they'll make adjustments to the minimum extent possible to respond to facts and circumstances that don't seem to conform. The Khashoggi affair, obviously an outrageous act, so the administration has expressed as much outrage as we would expect our administration to express, but not in any way that will be inconsistent with the Saudi strategy of coming up with explanations that absolve the Crown Prince of blame. And that began with Mr. Trump early on, very early on after the murder, talking about a rogue operation. And I expect we will also see no particular daylight between the administration and Riyadh with this latest explanation that came out today, in which, there was a Saudi prosecutor who made an announcement, and now the latest fall guy is some unnamed mid-level intelligence officer who was apparently in charge of one of the 3 teams that went to Istanbul. Again, no mention of the Crown Prince. And as far as the Yemeni war itself is concerned, what the cycle has been, over the last several weeks and months, despite increasing concern about this humanitarian disaster being expressed here on Capitol Hill by some Democrats and Republicans, the administration was basically blowing it off, even to the point of Secretary Pompeo in the congressionally mandated requirement to certify that the Saudi forces were taking due consideration to trying to minimize civilian casualties, said yes they are when they clearly aren't. Now the Khashoggi affair has brought that much more attention to the Yemen problem that the administration has had to make a further adjustment or two, and that now we've got the ending of the refueling, but not ending of the arms supply relationship or the intelligence sharing. So I think, Kelley, that's what we're going to continue to see. I think it's unfortunate that we have this, what I would describe as an uber-Manichaean approach to the Middle East, in which all the good guys are on one side of the line and all the bad guys are on the other side of the line. Even though the adjective transactional gets applied to the current administration's policies, we've seen anything but that in this very rigid division between good guys and bad guys. And I expect that's going to continue to be the case.
Well, I want to open this up to questions, but I do have a question for the panel, whoever wants to answer it. I mean, the elephant in the room here, in my mind, is Israel. And the Trump administration has basically cast its lot with Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. He has come through with campaign promises to move the embassy to Jerusalem. He's announced withdrawal of funding for the refugees, the Palestinian refugees. All of his moves has indicated that he really doesn't care if the peace process moves forward, even though he's suggested that Jared Kushner is working on a deal. How does this play out for our future relationship with the Arab world? Is this going to result in catastrophic violence in the region, or something less than, or just a slow bleed of the Palestinian territories? Does anybody speak about our policy with Israel in respect to the peace process that I mentioned was currently in shambles? I know this is a hot topic, but if anybody wants to.
I'll say something, because it relates to what we were just talking about with Saudi Arabia. In addition to, as Trita pointed out earlier, the rationale of our doing favors to the Saudis on behalf of bashing Iran, and as Trita mentioned, we don't need to drag the Saudis into doing that. I might add, we don't need to drag the Netanyahu government into doing that either. They are the draggers, not the draggees. But it's relevant to your current question, because one of the other objectives of the special relationship with Saudi Arabia has been this idea of the outside-in peace process, where we'd have other Arab governments, especially the Saudis, leaning on the Palestinians, to accept something other than a Palestinian state worthy of the name, and accept whatever will be the formula that the administration will come up with, and will lean heavily toward the Israeli side. But here, the inconvenient circumstance that keeps coming back up is, even though the premise of the outside-in, which is that Arab governments really don't care that much about the Palestinians' status anymore, that's true to a large extent, but there is still a lot of resonance on the street that simply cannot be ignored. And I think one indication of that was, after a lot of the reporting about how the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia was doing all his business with Jason Greenblatt and with Kushner, and was all set to perhaps push in exactly that direction they wanted to push, King Salman, in one of the few issues on which he would intervene, despite his declining faculties and advanced age, made it clear, reiterated, that we are still sticking with the Arab League peace initiative, which the previous king had championed, which talks about 1967 borders as the basis for any territorial settlement.
If I could add one, I think that in this situation, President Trump has been sort of transactional in the sense that Saudi Arabia and Israel have made a deal that America has helped pay the way for. And in a sense, Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman offered, in a sense, to deliver the Palestinians to the Israelis by supporting the move to Jerusalem, in exchange for America delivering Iran. And that seems to be what Kushner was about in his early period, is paving the way for the move to Jerusalem, this move against the Palestinians, supported by Saudi Arabia. Now, this only, it may seem to be a tactical win for the right wing in the United States, but it's going to weaken Saudi Arabia. And our policy, which is to double down on Saudi Arabia, as you've mentioned, is going to be weakened by this policy in the long run, because it's going to undermine the popularity and shift legitimacy towards America's competitors in the region.
Trita, and then...
Just a quick note. As Josh pointed out, this is a policy that ultimately is not likely to work, but it's also a policy that really does not make any sense from a U.S. national interest perspective. Because what you're having here is that the Saudis and the Israelis have this rather bizarre Wahhabi Zionist alliance right now, is rooted in the fact that they are very upset about how the balance of power in the region has shifted since the invasion of Iraq. They believe that the Iranians have been unleashed, that the balance has shifted towards Tehran, and what they want is for the United States to recreate the pre-2003 balance of power in the Middle East. And for that, they need this very, very aggressive approach towards Iran. And if you're sitting in Riyadh or you're sitting in Tel Aviv, perhaps that makes sense. Perhaps you can understand that. But someone has to answer to me the question, how is that in the interest of the United States if we are now in a position in which we've concluded that hegemony in the Middle East is no longer squarely in the interest of the United States, mindful of the cost that has been rising tremendously and mindful of the benefits that have been shrinking tremendously, mindful of the fact that the strategic importance of the Middle East has declined over the last 2 decades.
Just one thing also, we have to look at it in the context of the geopolitics of the Arab world. Historically, the Arab world, we don't see any changes in the positions of the governments towards the Palestinian issue. It's just historically the Arabs were split into two camps. One camp that was so sanguine about the Palestinian case and supporting the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause, and other countries that were just silent about it. And the former had been the leaders in the Arab League, where the kitchen where all of the Arab policies are cooked. Countries like Iraq, Egypt, to a point, Algeria, Syria, these were the ones that drove the activities of the Arab League. All of these countries now are in turmoil and they are not influential. So who is in charge of running the Arab League now? Are the formerly silent camp that wasn't really much about talking about the Palestinians. That's why you see the Arabs are no longer seen by the Palestinians and also by the populations there as the champions of the Palestinian cause. Instead, Iran is. That's why, in every last Friday of Ramadan, even in the Arab world, demonstrations come out to commemorate something called the Day of Jerusalem, or Al-Quds. And the one who called for it and the one who established it was none other than Grand Ayatollah Khomeini. So it is really right now the changes that happened in the internal politics of the former axis of Arab countries like Iraq, Algeria, and Syria and Egypt to a point is no longer as it used to be running Arab politics, and that's why you see a total shift in the entire Arab position. I always said that the best thing for the Palestinians, if they were really to get anything, is for the Arabs to get out of their cause. Then they will be able to get something. As long as the Arabs are, in the way, the Palestinians are not going to get anything.
Okay, I know I'm running out of time. I probably ran out of time, but I want to take at least one audience question because on principle, I have to.
My name is Kami, but I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is in the light of Kelley's statement that Bibi Netanyahu feel good about current American policies toward Iran. Do you think that this would help Trump to get American Jewish vote? And if he could do that, he can prove wrong to Jim Baker, who once said, doesn't matter what Republicans do, Republicans are not going to get Jewish vote in America. And my other part of this question is that Pompeo said that we want Iran to stop destabilizing Yemen, Syria, and those. Pompeo represents America, and America is fighting war directly with Taliban, Sunni Taliban, and they are being supported by Pakistan, by United Arab Emirates, and by Saudi Arabia. If Pompeo has American passport, why doesn't he put sanction against Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, because they are the one who are killing American, and they are the one who are wasting American resources directly. Why Pompeo need to go after Iran? Thanks.
Does anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I would just note the premise of your question is quite correct, not just in the Afghan South Asian context, but also in the Persian Gulf context, that if you're asking who is destabilizing the region, it is not true that Iran is responsible for everything that destabilizes those regions. And getting back to the Saudi comparison again, I mean, it was the Saudi regime that we've already talked about the Yemeni war that's doing the aerial stuff there. It's the Saudi regime that took the Lebanese prime minister hostage to try to foment a governmental crisis there. And it's the Saudi regime that apparently is, which the Iranians stopped doing years ago, in the business of extraterritorial assassination of nonviolent domestic dissidents. And I think everything you said about the Taliban relationships is applicable as well.
Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions. I really appreciate the panel and everything you brought to it, and I'd like to initiate a round of applause. Thank you very much.